Good morning. My name is Wayne Kaito. I'm the Assistant Provost for Global Engagement at Bridgewater State University. Welcome to this webinar and panel discussion about Ukraine. And Bridgewater State University welcomes everyone from our campus and in the local community and all around the world to have this very timely discussion about the Russian invasion of Ukraine and entering a critical period after 3 weeks. And today's discussion is an attempt to bring some of the experts together to talk about what has happened and what is going on right now and what the solutions may be with this major conflict in Europe. And we know that after 3 weeks ago, Russia started to invade Ukraine, and there have been reports of bombardments and casualties, and especially in the eastern part of Ukraine. But the war has also spread to other parts of Ukraine and also brings in questions about the effectiveness of containment and of the conflict, and whether this will turn into something very serious, and also the effects of on the Ukrainian people and people in the region. So Bridgewater State University is a public comprehensive university in Massachusetts, and this event is organized by the Munich Institute for Global Engagement. And I'd like to thank all the panelists here for agreeing to participate in our discussion, and also the administration from the university, including our provost, who may be in the audience right now, along with people signing in from different parts of the US and around the world. So our moderator and host today is Dr. Sidita Kushi, who's our assistant professor of political science at BSU, and she has been teaching courses on international relations, US foreign policy, and she was previously was a research fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies at the Fletcher School of Law at Tufts University. She also led the military intervention project at Tufts, and she's the author of articles on many areas of the conflict, and published in many journals about Europe, European diplomacy and security. And she it has a book, so she's working on a book on humanitarian military conflict from about Darfur to the Balkans, from Kosovo to Darfur, and that's really over a period of 20 years. So bring Sidita. So please go ahead and introduce other speakers.
Thank you so much, Dr. To, for the introduction and the opening remarks. So I am very pleased to have our expert panelists today with us to discuss the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have Dr. Maya Davis Cross, who is the Edward Brooke Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at Northeastern University. She researches international cooperation, especially in the areas of European foreign policy and security, crises, as well as diplomacy. And her most recent book is titled European-Russian Power Relations in Turbulent Times from University of Michigan Press, published recently in 2021. And then we have Dr. Polina Belyakova, a senior PhD research fellow at the Center for Strategic Studies within the Fletcher School of Diplomacy at Tufts University. And her research focuses on civil-military relations, intrastate conflict, democratic governance, and international security, with a regional interest and focus on Russia, Ukraine, and Israel. And then we have Dr. Misha Elashvili. He is a professor at Elias State University within Georgia, and he is currently an international Fulbright scholar here at Bridgewater State University, and he will provide a strong interdisciplinary perspective and a personal on-the-ground perspective as a resident and citizen within Georgia at the time of these relevant conflicts and crises. Thank you so much to all of our panelists today for joining us for this very relevant and important discussion. I will also serve as one of the 4 panelists along the way. But let us delve directly into the first set of questions, which will provide us with some historical background to contextualize the current ongoing invasion and crisis within Ukraine. So the first question that I have for the panelists relate to historical origins. So in 1991, the USSR collapses, and it collapses and leads to 15 different independent states and national movements. By 1992, Ukraine begins to talk to NATO for the first time. My question is, how did we get here? What are some key historical and political developments that have led up to Russia's current invasion of Ukraine? And I would like to start off with Dr. Belyakova, if possible.
Yeah, thank you so much. So before I give answer to this question, I want to make this disclaimer that I bring my professional expertise here. I also bring my personal experience. I was born and raised in Kyiv. I lived there for 25 years of my life. My mother is still there in Kyiv, hiding from the missile attacks. My in-laws are currently refugees, or they're applying for the refugee status in Europe. So some might say that it makes me biased. Other people might say that it makes me well positioned to talk about what's going on. It's up to you to decide, but I want you to know the background from which I'm talking. So I will paint a general picture here just to explain Russian thinking about Ukraine in general. And it pertains to the historic background. Russia conceptually historically does not see Ukraine as a foreign country, period. We learned from the recent speech of Vladimir Putin that Ukrainian statehood itself is actually a threat to Russian security. He said this. And we see it also in how Russia formulates its foreign policy, again, historically, before this war, before this invasion, and even before 2014. For example, Russia has three intelligence branches. One, external foreign intelligence, another is military intelligence, and domestic intelligence. We know now for a fact that it was domestic intelligence that was responsible for Ukraine, not only for this conflict, but historically. So while the dissolution of the Soviet Union, of course, set the stage for the emergence of these 15 different states, in Russian foreign policy and policy making, it was seen as a mistake. So every step of Ukrainian crystallization of statehood was historically seen as something that has to be undone. We see it in Russian policies. We see it even in how it uses its tools of statecraft, which again, intelligence is just one of the examples. And we also see it in the messaging that Russia uses when it pertains to Ukraine. For example, when the revolution of dignity happened, the Euromaidan happened, in Russian, there was a protest with a huge banner saying, Euromaidan, we will not forgive, we will not forget. And my question as Ukrainian was, how are you in a position to forgive or forget something that happened in the foreign country at all? But that's the main historical background that we have to keep in mind, that historically, Russia does not see Ukraine as a foreign country and does not behave with it as such. I will stop here.
Thank you so much. Dr. Cross, do you have any additional historical key milestones or points you would like to add?
Sure. Polina gave an excellent overview, and I think I would just pick up in the early 21st century and talk about sort of Putin's claim that he is in part attacking Ukraine because of the expansion of NATO. So one part of this history is that in the early 21st century, when Putin was already in power, he was actually moving Russia closer to the West gradually. He was cooperating closely with NATO through the NATO-Russia Council, which existed from 2002 to 2008. And this was a pretty intensive form of cooperation, joint military exercises, tackling a whole range of international challenges together. And even as NATO enlarged, Russia actually continued under Putin to get closer to the West, even suggesting and having discussions about possibly joining NATO at some point, even possibly joining the EU. So this kind of discussion about, NATO is backing Russia into a corner and therefore Putin has no choice but to invade is really a red herring, I think. What we're actually seeing, and of course Russia's behavior does start to change in 2008 with the invasion of Georgia. And even after that, though, there were still efforts, to have this kind of reset under the Obama administration. But I think what really has been more of a threat to Putin over this period, and what sort of signals that shift from being closer to the West to veering away from the West, and then ultimately to this violence, is that, the Western values, EU membership, democracy, all of these things have been actually attractive to post-Soviet states. Post-Soviet states, for the most part, have actually looked to the West. Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova applied for EU membership. So, there was this kind of this switch that happened with the invasion of Georgia, and then in 2014, the taking of Crimea. But I think really this emphasis on NATO should be kind of questioned when we look at the pattern historically.
Thank you so much. Dr. Elashvili, would you like to add, especially as related to the Georgia invasion in 2008?
Thank you. Yes, I would like to add, and I'll basically continue what Paulina and what Maya were saying, that from the historical, first of all, from the historical perspectives, what we are talking right now, for our countries, it's an escape from the Soviet Union. And we are still trying to escape. And then you can call it either Soviet Union, but you can go even further to the history and you can call it Russian Empire. Because in the beginning of the 20th century, my country and Ukraine as well had another try to escape from the Russian Empire, which ended up with the Holodomor in Ukraine and ended up with the invasion of the Red Army into the Georgia in 1921. So this is very, it has even larger perspective. And the problem is that this Russian Empire then transformed to the Soviet Union. And still now, yes, I will say that Russians do not treat Ukraine as a foreign country, but they don't treat even Georgia as a foreign country, though ethnically we are so different from Russians. But still, they think it's part of the empire, it's part of their homeland. So the problem starts at this stage, at this point. And then another problem is that, of course, it's not just the government of the Russia, but it's a majority of the population of the Russia, and it's public opinion of the Russians. So that shows the complexity of the problem. And then this problem is expressed by us, our countries trying to, yes, move towards the West, because these are the values which are attractive. This is the way of life I wish for my kids. And at the same time, Russia is opposing to that. And then as stronger is our movement towards the Europe, stronger are the reaction from the Russia. And finally, having invasion in Georgia, invasion in Crimea, and then this Donetsk and Lugansk part of the Ukraine. And now we have a full-scale war in the Europe. And that's Russia's reaction to our movement towards the East, towards the democracy.
Thank you so much. Our panelists have done a pretty thorough dive into the recent history. I would just like to add a few points related to what all three panelists mentioned. This historical assumption that Russia was somehow threatened by the West or threatened by NATO after the collapse of the Soviet Union. I'd like to add a little bit of my own context to that and a little bit of mild historical details in the 1990s. So for those in the audience who are not necessarily familiar with the Budapest Memorandum, this is a brief reminder that after the collapse of the Soviet Union, Ukraine actually traded the world's third largest stockpile of intercontinental ballistic missiles for the assurance of sovereignty from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. So this was a very big sacrifice that Ukraine made so it could be a sovereign state within Eastern Europe. So keep that in mind. And then fast forward to 2008, Ukraine formally initiates ties with NATO. Now, between the 1990s and 2008, there has been a very strong narrative that somehow it was the West, somehow it was NATO, somehow it was the European Union that pushed Eastern European states, pushed Ukraine, and pushed the Baltics even to join their Western alliance to the detriment of Russia's security. But what is lost in this narrative is the agency of these individual Eastern European states. This narrative makes it so that the only countries that matter are Russia and the United States. They rarely delve into the historical narrative and fact that a lot of Eastern European countries pushed and promoted and urged the West to join these alliances, whether military defense or civilian alliances through the European Union. And the main reason they pushed to join these alliances is as a defensive mechanism against Russian aggression and Russian empire, as our panelists have discussed. All right, on that note, we're going to move on to our second question, and this relates to Russia's current intentions. And the first question in this line is, how does Russia's previous foreign policy in the region speak to Ukraine today? So here I'm looking for a little bit more detail on Georgia's invasion of Georgia in 2008 and the invasion of Crimea in 2014, and possibly other moves of Russian expansionism during the more contemporary era. Let's see, Mikhail, Dr. Ilashvili, would you like to start us off with that?
Yes, thank you. Yes, speaking of how does Russia's previous foreign policy speaks for the Ukraine's full-scale war right now. In Georgia, 2008, it's as we mentioned, invasion to Georgia, it's just one in the row. It's not something, let's say, outstanding for the Russian policy, as now we can see. But there is interesting thing that 2008 was the first case when the Russia officially participated with its militaries into the conflict. So, and previously there were many other cases, let's say even inside the Russia, like war in Chechnya, which was really devastating, caused a huge humanitarian crisis, but not much paid attention to from the Western society. And then there were many other cases also on the territory of Georgia, Russia supporting the separatist regions and doing the same things in Donetsk and Lugansk, saying that this is not Russian army fighting, that these are the locals fighting. But we all knew that it was the Russian army, but it was never officially declared. So in case of 2008, it was officially declared war to Georgia, an invasion of the Russian army into another sovereign country. But another thing, it shows how gradually Russia's, let's say, appetite was increasing, and how open they were becoming in terms of the scale of their invasion and the scale of their aggression. So what invasion in Georgia shows to us right now is that seems like Russia, from one side, Russia was testing the West, the reaction of the West, and gradually increasing the rate of its military forces, its generally its use of the weapons, and testing what is the reaction. And this, at the same time, Russia was gaining the appetite and feeling that it can do more. It can really try to restore the Soviet Union in its historical limits. And that was what finally Putin was saying to us on March of 23rd, I guess, just the day before, in his open speech. So that's how I can see this from the Georgian perspective, but generally how historical perspective lead us to the full-scale invasion in the Ukraine right now.
Thank you. And a connector follow-up question from that I have for Dr. Cross would be, during these Russian foreign policy moves and acts of aggression, what have been Western responses, whether NATO or EU responses to these previous moves, but also as connected to contemporary discussions on the invasion of Ukraine?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Misha on kind of there were signposts along the way that Putin is basically ratcheting up his willingness to kind of get out there in foreign policy terms, to strut on the world stage, to be aggressive. I do, of course, put all of the blame on Putin. I also would have liked to see a bit of a stronger Western response to each of these episodes, especially 2008 Georgia and 2014 Crimea. The EU, though, in the wake of Crimea and the Euromaidan protests, did pull together in a pretty strong way for the EU and what it could do. And it did execute a big, wide-ranging sanctions regime, nothing like today, of course, which is unprecedented. But EU diplomacy did work in response to this. And I think part of the reason was because the Ukrainians were very clear that they saw their future as in the EU. They were waving EU flags, and this was an important signal of things to come. I think Putin was doing this in part because he was worried about maintaining his domestic power and domestic support. It's not as though he's had continuous raving reviews within the Russian domestic public. And so part of his strategy to stay in power was to do these kind of big, aggressive moves internationally as a way to sort of rally around the flag and to maintain power domestically. But at the same time, he has miscalculated, perhaps because the Western response could have been a bit stronger. He has miscalculated the extent to which the EU would come together in this latest invasion, and the fact that the Western alliance would hold so strong and actually take these unprecedented actions that are really remarkable on multiple levels. I'm afraid I need to step away from the panel for a few minutes, but I'll be back and happy to participate in the Q&A soon. Sorry to leave.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cross. She will join us very shortly for the Q&A, but please, Dr. Belyakova, for a response.
So I will take a role of a person painting a general picture because that's important. When we talk about Russia, we often impose Western assumptions about how Russia works and how foreign policy works onto an essentially non-Western state. And what I mean, first of all, is our assumption that public opinion matters as much as it does in the United States. And it's not. I conducted empirical analysis on that, and I found that actually Putin's support went down after the invasion of Georgia in 2008. His public support right before the Crimea was over the top because of the Olympics, of course. So he already had very high public support even before annexing Crimea. Of course, after the annexation, it went even higher. But for us now seeing the entire picture, it looks, oh, he invaded Crimea to increase the popular support. That's not correct. It was already very high. He did not have to do that. Also, his support already plummeted after he invaded Syria. And experts on Russian foreign policy who specifically specialize in this region, they actually point at this bias among Western scholars. So instead of looking at popular support and popular engagement, we should be looking at persistent drivers in Russian foreign policy. And there are two of them. First is the necessity of primacy in the region as a security concern, because Russia sees itself as situated in a plain, flat land that can be taken from the West. So Ukraine is a very important buffer zone for that. That's one. And second is a pure recognition as a great power. So for Russia, it's less important to be friends with other great powers than being at the table with other great powers. So even now, when Russia is under heavy sanctions, the fact that President Macron calls Putin almost every day is actually a little bit of a win for Russia, because historically its foreign policy was driven by this necessity and willingness to enter the dialogue with great powers, to talk only with the great powers and not say with Ukraine. So conflict in Ukraine and the war that just started, they are the outcomes of Russia's attempts of regional integration in what it sees as its sphere of influence. I just want to remind you that the Euromaidan crisis, or the revolution of dignity in Ukraine of 2013, started because Ukraine refused to join the customs union, is the economic wing of Russian regional integration effort. That's about that. It's the primacy in the region. So I would invite us all to switch a little bit our focus from public opinion to those two, again, primacy in the region and peer recognition by great powers.
Thank you so much for that. So the main point that I want to emphasize from Dr. Belyakova's discussion is that time and time again, in a lot of popular media narratives, we hear that Putin is being aggressive or Putin is invading as a way to distract from domestic opposition, as a way to distract from domestic problems. And what Dr. Belyakova is saying is that due to her empirical research, this is actually the opposite of what she finds. So the focus that we should be having is not necessarily domestically, as many Western media sources are pushing, but the understanding of Russia's positioning globally with that historical context that was provided for us. Thank you for that discussion. And if I may add a few things to that discussion on previous foreign policy, and then we will move on to Putin's intentions currently in Ukraine and international responses. So as per my own research, I have researched the Russian invasion, intervention, and annexation of Crimea in 2014. And I have researched it looking for how Russia co-opts Western liberal norms and discourse. So I remember when Russia next invaded Crimea in 2014, it was very interesting to see how Russia framed invasion. It framed it in the same kind of wording and terminology that Western military interventions have occurred, saying that they are protecting ethnic minorities in Crimea, they are promoting self-determination. This is okay under international law because the West did the same thing with NATO in 1999 in Kosovo. So Putin is co-opting the language of the West, language of the international world order currently, to make his interventions more legitimate and to also make them on par with the big players within the international world order. And as Dr. Belyakova mentioned to us, he is very much interested in that peer competition, in being seen as a great power once more. And it was in 1999 when NATO intervened in Yugoslavia to stop the Serbian ethnic cleansing of ethnic Albanians in Kosovo that Russia was very slighted because they were under the expectation that they would be considered, they would be included in the peace building and the peacekeeping and the intervention itself. And when the West did not include them in a major way, that was a slight to Russia's standing internationally, and that was a low blow. And this is something that Putin mentions over and over again when he justifies Crimea, when he justifies Georgia, and how he's currently justifying Ukraine, saying that the West did it, so we are okay in doing it too. We are not breaching any sort of norm or value. We are in fact promoting them. But of course, that is extremely disingenuous because while he is mentioning these norms, he still refuses to recognize them in areas of the world that are against Russian interests and his own interests. So he is allowed to promote human rights or so on in Ukraine, supposedly, but the same does not apply to the promotion of human rights in Yugoslavia in 1999. Okay. So let's move on to a more direct line of what are Putin's current intentions and goals in Ukraine. So if I may ask Dr. Belyakova again to give us a little bit of a rundown on that.
Sure. So I recently noticed that Putin was telling us what he wants all the time. We're not willing to listen because it sounds like megalomaniac ambitions of redrawing the map of Europe and reshaping world politics. And again, many Western observers thought that, oh, he's setting an overtone window. He will demand, for example, NATO's back roll to 1997 borders, not borders, but like the borders of the alliance, I mean, membership. And then he will be happy with, I don't know, 2003. That's not what's going on. So Putin was pretty straightforward, and the Kremlin, his administration, they were pretty straightforward about what they want to do. They want to have more of a say in European security by backrolling NATO. That's straightforward. they want to deny Ukraine independent statehood, as in the right for independent foreign policy. And when I mean independent foreign policy, I mean foreign policy independent from the Kremlin. So they would be okay with Ukraine being formally independent with the government that is friendly enough to the Kremlin not to have independent foreign policy. And Putin, again, was pretty straightforward about that. And in terms of Russia-US relations, is the same. The guarantees that Putin demanded from the United States is the withdrawal of nuclear weapons from the territories of other states, and also the areas proximate where Russia and US are close to one another. It's not setting the overtone window. That's exactly what he wants. So, of course, with the war in Ukraine now ongoing for 3 weeks, Russian administration, they're trying to find some wiggle room between the initial ambitious goals that they stated and how the war is going on. So they keep changing, first of all, the justification of war. Almost like every 4 or 5 days we hear a new reason, and also the end goals. So maybe when the war is over, they would claim, oh, we just wanted to have a land corridor from Russia to Crimea or something like this. But initially, I believe that the ambition was all three. Better say in European security, denial of Ukrainian independent foreign policy, and reshaping the relationship with the US.
Thank you. Dr. Elashvili, would you like to add anything to that list of Putin's intentions in Ukraine today?
No, I just want to add, I just want to say and summarize that those intentions, which Paulina very nicely listed down here, those are unacceptable. Those are unacceptable to the world order as we can see it. And they contain a huge danger for the peace and for the safety of the world order. And that's what I want our audience to understand and to see, that, as I said, Putin's appetite gradually increasing and finally ending up with such a statements and such a requirements. So that's the only thing I can say.
Thank you so much. That is a strong underscore in her point. Dr. Belikova?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a small remark that while I'm saying Putin, 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 this idea about Russian influence in European security predates Putin's rule. I was working with recently declassified documents. It's memorandums of conversations between Presidents Clinton and Yeltsin. And if I'm not mistaken, in 1996, President Yeltsin straightforwardly told Bill Clinton, Bill, please leave Europe to me. Moscow is in Europe. I am European. Russia will take care of Europe. You take care of your region. This archival document actually exists. So any ideas that, oh, it's enough to replace Putin, or any dreams about regime change in Russia as a solution to the problem, I would not be very optimistic about that, because again, Yeltsin, who is now generally seen as the friend of the West, actually was the first person in independent Russia outside of the Soviet Union, should I say it this way, to actually mention that Russia has to be a dominant power in European security. It's not Putin.
Thank you for that. This goes beyond Putin. This is not just Putin dictating the terms of Russia's intentions and demands, as Paulina has so clearly mentioned as per her archival research. This is a broader scope. And I want to re-emphasize some of these points because we do hear quite extensively, whether in academia or in public social circles, that Russia or Putin, depending on who you are talking to, while they are intervening in Ukraine because they want to retain their former sphere of influence in Eastern Europe and the Caucasus, they are anxious about NATO's eastward expansion. So they are framing this as a legitimate security threat to Russia's, existence and sovereignty. But our discussion is a stark reminder that at the end of the day, the way that Russia defines its security isn't a very traditional minimalist understanding of it. Russia has a very maximalist understanding of security. And what it boils down to is Russia is insecure for as long as Russia is not able to dominate its neighborhood, for as long as Russia is not able to become an empire within Eastern Europe. So whenever we hear narration saying Ukraine should take the deal with Russia, Ukraine should let go of certain territories or accept not being able to join international institutions as a way to break peace or to make peace possible. Well, what they are saying is that Russia is legitimate in the way that it defines its security. Russia is legitimate in wanting to become an expanding empire and wanting to dominate and control its sovereign Eastern neighbors. So on that note, thank you so much for that very thorough discussion of Russia's intentions and Putin's intentions. Now, given this context of intentions, there have been a wide range of international responses to Russia's invasion of Ukraine from the West, from NATO members, from EU members, and also from many non-Western members at the United Nations and beyond. And my question for you is, which one of these responses have been the most surprising to you? And then should the West do more than it currently is doing to retaliate against Russia's invasion? And Paulina, if you don't mind getting us started.
Yes, so the most surprising part of it for me was the degree to which Russia was not prepared, because they did not expect that the West will act as a united force. So it's not one particular type of sanctions. Is it SWIFT, or is it buying Russian resources? It's the combination of it and a synchronized effort by Western countries, because actually the Kremlin was working consistently on disorganizing and disjointing the West. Some of the opinions of Hungarian President Orban, for example, they show that Russia had some success in that. However, it was not enough to prevent the West and some non-Western countries to join the sanctions. So it's the complex. Also, one of the most painful responses that Russia did not anticipate is not the sanctions by the governments, but the withdrawal of private companies. For example, IKEA withdrawing from Russia has nothing to do with Swedish government at all. The same about McDonald's. It's not the American governmental sanction, it's the company itself withdrawing. It's foreign to Russian thinking to accept the existence of these independent agents, because under Putin's regime specifically, everything turned into these state companies. So that's why they did not expect, for example, McDonald's from withdrawing. And the significance of that is not that Russian people will not eat cheeseburgers. It's not that, but it's the fact that McDonald's will not contribute taxes and its millions of dollars, the tens of millions of dollars into Russian economy that will then fall on the heads of my friends and family in Ukraine. So that's the significance. And the same pertains to IKEA and other companies. So Sedita, when you're asking what the West should do, as the governments, they're doing a lot in terms of sanctions. Now, the important part is actually to arm Ukraine, so Ukraine will be capable of closing its sky on its own, because NATO is clearly, for good reasons, unwilling to do that. I mean, they have a very sound justification for not doing that, but the sky has to be closed. So if not by NATO hands, it has to be done by Ukrainian hands. So that's what the West can be doing. Us, as the residents or citizens of Western societies, if we support Ukraine in this conflict, applying pressure to the private companies actually helps. I was following closely the Uniqlo, which is the Japanese brand of clothing, very popular in Russia. Initially, they decided not to withdraw. After customer pressure from all over the world, now they're withdrawing from Russia. They're not the main contributor into Russian economy, but there are still some brands that are, and most of them are tobacco companies.
Before I move on to our next panelist, Paulina, if you don't mind, can you give us a little bit of an understanding of why NATO is so unwilling to implement a no-fly zone over Ukraine? It has been called for by many different parties, but it is currently off the table. And you mentioned that there are good reasons for that. What are some of those reasons?
So the argument is that if NATO introduces the no-fly zone, of course, it's not enough to just declare it. Someone has to enforce it. And it means NATO soldiers and NATO capabilities targeting directly Russian soldiers and Russian capabilities. And in the grand scheme of it all, it ends up in World War III, and the doomsday scenario is actually the use of nuclear weapons. We don't know whether it will happen or not. Some people argue that World War III has already started. It just started in Ukraine. So it's up to you whether you join or not. But while it's still war between Ukraine and Russia, the use of nuclear weapons is unlikely. If I will put it more briefly, Russia has no chance of winning a war against NATO, but it has nuclear weapons. So it increases the chances that maybe they will consider the use of nuclear weapons to prevent Russia's destruction. That's it. That's the main reason for not closing the sky over Ukraine by the hands of NATO. It does not mean that the sky over Ukraine should not be closed by other means.
Thank you so much for that clarification. Truly appreciated. Dr. Elashvili, would you like to add to what have been the most surprising, and then what the West can do to guide and help resolve this conflict?
Yes, just first, I just want to add a couple of words to the last sentences Polina said, that closing the sky over the Ukraine by NATO forces, that would cause clearly NATO planes in the Ukrainian sky fighting with the Russian jets, and that would mean that Putin can say to its own population that, see guys, NATO is fighting with Russia. And that shows that this scenario, how everything could develop. So, I mean, I understand that. Speaking of sanctions, yeah, I think we can summarize that what was unexpected for Putin is total isolation. We can call it that way. He was isolated, and it includes not just political or financial sanctions, but also the public opinion all over the world, I guess. And you can see that Russia was left with I don't know who else is supporting right now Russia. Yeah, technically there are very few countries which can say that they are supporting Russia in this situation. So Russia got isolated completely, and this is the first time it happened. So again, looking back to the history of the last 2 decades, let's say, it was never happening. Every Russia invasion or misbehavior, let's say, was kind of excused finally to Russia. And they never got this solidarity, this solidarity, I mean, solidarity from the Western states, isolating the Russia and opposing the Russia's actions. So yes, this was unexpected to the Russia. You can see right now that there are a lot of, I don't know the exact number. I can just see the official numbers on the news, but there are people from all over the world going, I mean, towards Ukraine to fight against Russia. And Russia is showing videos of soldiers from, what was that country? I mean, you could compare who stands and who supports whom in this war. And this is the first time it has happened. What more can be done? It's difficult to discuss from here, but clearly one thing which comes to my mind that I'm quite disappointed with Europe still being so much dependent on Russian oil and gas, so that they cannot sanction buying, purchasing the Russian oil and gas, because this is a pure money. These are the numbers which goes to support Russian army directly. You're buying 1 cubic meter of the Russian gas, somebody is shooting another missile to the Ukraine. I mean, it's a direct connection there. So that's one thing I can say.
So much. And to add to that commentary, I was very personally surprised when Germany was one of the first countries to not certify Nord Stream 2, because Germany has been very interwoven with Russia's economy through gas and energy purchases, and it has pacified Russia's aggression due to this interconnection. So when Germany said, put a full stop to that. And it looks as though we are seeing a shift in German foreign policy and German relationships to Russia, which might begin a new era in which the West no longer pacifies Russia as it has in the past. And of course, as Polina mentioned earlier, the reason the no-fly zone is a no-go is because Putin has already put his nuclear weapons on high alert as a way to deter any further Western intervention, any further Western military support. Now, we don't know whether that is actually just a bluff as a way to appear more dangerous and to keep international actors from getting involved, or whether there is a possibility of nuclear weapons usage. And we also will eventually discuss in the Q&A the impact of China here, because a lot of international actors are in opposition to Russia today, but there is a possibility that China might support Russia in some ways. We don't necessarily know what the degree of that support, or even if there is any support, might be. Now we have a little bit more time, so I do want to delve into the humanitarian reality in Ukraine, if I might. So the question that I have for our panelists is, what is the extent of the humanitarian suffering on the ground in Ukraine? And this could include refugee crises and regional responses. Polina, if you might, go ahead.
One of the painfully ironic answers to this question is that it's the Russian-speaking population that is the most suffering from Putin's war in Ukraine now. And the explanation for that is geography, of course, that the regions that are bordering Russia, they're historically Russian-speaking. It does not mean, however, that the populations there, they actually support the Kremlin. They want to join Russia. Well, my mother tongue is Russian. My native language is Ukrainian because my mother speaks Russian. My nation speaks Ukrainian. That's the way I explain it to people. And many people who live in that region, they're exactly like me. So the degree of suffering, we don't know all, because areas that are under occupation, and there are some areas in Chernihiv region, in Kherson region, in Mariupol region, we don't know the full scale of Russian effect in those areas, but it's massive destruction, people lacking water, food, women giving birth in basements. Also, of course, indiscriminate shelling of residential neighborhoods, and the entire villages just wiped out of the face of earth, and about 3 million refugees that crossed border to the western side, European side. There are some people who were evacuated to Russia from the previously occupied Donetsk and Luhansk regions. It's very difficult to estimate. Russia claims 10,000 people. It's not clear what's the number now at the moment. Nevertheless, these people are also displaced Ukrainians. Whatever happens to them in Russia, they are also displaced populations that need humanitarian support. And the situation is ongoing and unfolding. I was expecting more internally displaced people than refugees before Russia started this war. However, with missile attacks, and we're talking long-range missiles launched from Belarusian territory, but also from the Black Sea, and also from the Russian territory directly, even Western Ukraine is now not a safe area. So that explains the number of refugees currently in Europe. The European Union now legislated a special status for refugees. It's not refugee status, it's temporary protection, which is more flexible, easier to attain, which gives Ukrainians some privileges of working in Europe, for example, without applying for refugee status. Unfortunately, I know it too well because my family is now trying to get that one. And again, it's still ongoing. So I'm not giving you any numbers. I'm just giving you pictures and images, because that's what we receive from those areas.
Thank you so much, Polina. Recently, a couple of weeks ago, actually, the Amnesty International, one of the leading NGOs on human rights, has said that Russia has been targeting civilians in what could amount to possible war crimes down the line. And the United Nations has been investigating Russian targeting of civilians as well in Ukraine, because there is a suspicion of war crimes being committed within Ukraine against civilian targets. Dr. Elishvili, would you like to further add to the humanitarian dimension of this?
Yes, please. I just want to add, but also from another perspective that, first of all, Russia, in human rights in Russia, which were totally neglected during the last years, and the world society wasn't raising its voice, and okay, it's happening in Russia, let them do whatever they want with their own humans, and what the Russia did with their own opposition leaders, shooting them, poisoning them, and now nobody should expect them to be human during the full-scale war and invasion. So there is a direct connection between these two. And yes, now we have about 3 million of refugees leaving the Ukraine towards the Europe, and we have, I guess, 0 going towards the Russia. Yeah, and only those 10,000 who were evacuated, and the same evacuation happened in Georgia in 2008 from those 2 regions where Russia invaded. I mean, it's officially planned. It's just PR action, nothing else. So, yeah, I just wanted to point out this situation that the human rights within the Russia and how those were neglected, and that finally leading to this humanitarian crisis. And then another thing, another brief remark that when Russia is trying, Sivita was mentioning that then Russia is trying to position their own military operations, how they call it, and compare those to what NATO did, to what US does in some other parts of the world. And now can you compare the humanitarian side of those operations? I mean, how drastically they differ, yeah? So this is what we get.
Yes, and I can add to that. Russia is comparing what it is doing in Ukraine, in Crimea, in Georgia, to the NATO humanitarian intervention in Kosovo in 1999. The humanitarian intervention in Kosovo in 1999 came in the aftermath of years of diplomacy, pretty much Western passivity, years of ethnic cleansing, and even genocide occurring in the region in the Western Balkans. It was a limited aerial intervention with no attempt to target civilians, and it was in response to genocide, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity committed in the region by the Serbian regime for at least 5 years prior. And then, of course, Putin compares what he's doing in Ukraine to what NATO did in Yugoslavia in 1999. But of course, the difference is that there was no ethnic cleansing going on in Ukraine, no genocide committed by the government, and there was no attempt at long-term diplomacy. And of course, Russia had already occupied, invaded, annexed Crimea years prior to Putin's current invasion of Ukraine. So those humanitarian justifications are merely that, the co-opting of Western norms. And to add to the humanitarian kind of dimension here is that what is currently happening in Ukraine, what Russia is doing in Ukraine, echoes across Europe. So my expertise is in the Western Balkans. And the Western Balkans, there are separatist movements ready to break from their current states. Bosnia and Herzegovina is a particularly vulnerable case because it is split into 3 factions, a tribe presidency. 3 groups lead the government in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and one of these factions, led by the Bosnian Serbs, the Republika Srpska, has been regularly meeting with Putin and Russian counterparts and has received very strong support from Russia for their separatist movements out of Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this separatist movement is only growing bolder and bolder, while of course the allies, the Serbian government, has failed to directly condemn Russia, failed to place sanctions upon Russia, and has actually been protecting certain Russian individuals and assets. So what Russia is doing against Ukraine echoes within the Western Balkans. It might lead to emboldened separatist movements, potential violence, and potential irredentism by Serbian government leaders down the line, which could break another humanitarian crisis in that part of the world as well. Now, I would like to end this guided discussion with discussions of solutions to possibly ending the war. So what are some scenarios that might bring Russia's war in Ukraine to an end? And then which of these scenarios would Ukraine be willing to accept? That is a very important caveat. So what are some possible scenarios that would bring the war to an end? and which one of these scenarios would be possibly acceptable to Ukraine? Paulina, if you want to take your time and then go ahead and respond.
As I mentioned before, the situation is very fluid, and no one expected the Ukrainian armed forces to be so capable in resisting Russian aggression, and it pertains directly to what kind of scenarios would be acceptable for Ukraine. Ukrainian military capabilities are still inferior to those of Russia. Both countries are actually ridden by systemic corruption in defense sector. Russia is famous for that. Ukraine is less famous, but also corruption is a big problem. So how Ukraine compensates for that is the motivation, the public will to support the armed forces, to join the armed forces and to fight for their country. And it limits the range of opportunities and options that Ukrainian public will consider acceptable. And the longer Ukraine survives in this war, and now it's third week already, this window is narrowing because Ukrainian public, they have this feeling that actually they can resist and maybe they can even dream about prevailing or at least fighting a war of attrition against Russia at a great human cost, by the way. So 2 weeks ago, I would say, oh, maybe Ukraine would be willing to actually give up its sovereignty over the Donbas area and the temporarily occupied territories in Donbas and Lugansk. Now I'm not quite sure that that would be an acceptable option, but it's the minimum acceptable option. How it can end is the attrition of Russian economy. One of the possibilities, and that's why sanctions are so important. There are some speculations about coup in Russia. There are several limitations to these scenarios. First, Russian military is not a coup-prone and not politicized institution at all. It's politically controlled, but it's not politically active. So even the coup of 1991 was led by the KGB more than the military as an institution itself. Several prominent generals, they joined the plot, but the military as such did not. So I'm not very hopeful about a military coup. A security service coup, more likely scenario. I'm not sure how that can happen because we don't know about the internal workings of the regime. So some internal collapse of the Russian regime is one of the preferable scenarios for Ukraine, of course. Is that not the Ukrainian armed forces will defeat the enemy and then will run over Russia until the Kremlin and then liberate Russia from Putin. That's not a plausible scenario, but rather that the regime will crumble under the pressure of sanctions and also the military losses. That would be an ideal acceptable scenario for Ukraine. Realistically speaking, I think that now both sides are working on kind of a deal that will be partially face-saving for Putin, but also acceptable in Ukraine. But it's a very, very narrow window. So maybe giving up sovereignty over Crimea or something like this, but I'm not quite sure that Zelensky, even with all the glory and attraction and fun groups that are following him now, he will not be able to sustain now making that deal because people in Ukraine know that while the diplomacy and Zelensky and Kuleba, our foreign minister, they're doing a great job in creating this image of Ukraine as a country worth fighting for, the people on the ground, they're paying a very high price and they will not be willing to accept concessions. So to summarize, first is minimum territorial concessions with limitations, of course, and second is internal collapse of Russian regime.
Thank you so much. Now, Dr. Elishvili, do you have any possible scenarios you would like to introduce or emphasize?
Let me put this question from another perspective. Let's do a more long time range to the end of the war and to the peace and to the safety. So as it was mentioned already here, it's not just Putin himself personally, though he is playing a great role in all of this crisis that is happening. But if not Putin, there will be somebody else. And before the Putin, there was Helsin, and he was kind of carrying the same ideas. So What I see that there should be also some lessons learned, and we should think about a more long time range here. And what I see is I see the consistency, continuity of Putin's actions and policy during the 20 years or so, and inconsistency from the Europe and from the United States, which is caused also by the democratic model of the organization of the states, because the presidents have one term or two terms only, and they don't think on the 20 and 30 years perspectives on the problems. And they are quite prone to solve problems, locally, but not globally. And also population of the countries which are not directly involved, it's absolutely clear that they don't want to stay in this state of the war, and for them it's better to forget about that as soon as possible and continue their daily life. So there should be some more consistency right now. And I just will give you one example which explains what I'm saying, again from the history from 2008 in Georgia. Russian invasion, and I saw there was one question about how that was ended, the Russian invasion to Georgia. And to be honest, that was the very first question texted here. And it was not ended, believe me. The Western reaction, what it did, it prevented Russian army from entering Tbilisi, the capital of Georgia. Okay, but Russian military bases are all over the occupied territories in Georgia, and they are as far as 30 kilometers. It's 20 miles from Tbilisi. Can you imagine that distance from here, I mean, locally? So they're here, and Georgia has a government right now, and I'm a Georgian citizen saying that. Georgia has a government which is quiet now, which is not saying a word of support to the Ukraine, being so afraid of the Russia. So, and why that happened? Because it was the end of the presidency of the Bush, and then the new presidency of Obama's cabinet started. And in a few years, I think it was like a year or two after this Russian invasion in Georgia, there was this reset of the relations with Russia, and like nothing happened. And the sanctions were forgotten. And all this resistance by the Europe was forgotten to the Russia and forgiven to the Russia. And then we got the continuation of the problem. So we have to learn. And I totally agree and understand all of the models which Paulina just figured out here, how this war could be ended. But as well, let's think about in a longer time range, how to sustain the peace, how to protect the safety of the population all over the world, and how to prevent this from happening again.
Thank you so much. And exactly, one of our first questions in the chat was, how did Russia's invasion of Georgia end? And you covered that beautifully. Unfortunately, Georgia is still occupied by Russia. 20% of its territory remains occupied by Russia at this point in time. And what we notice is that these things are brushed under the rug until something happens again. And clearly we are seeing an escalation of aggression within Eastern Europe and the Caucasus. So at this point in time, I do want to reserve the remaining 25 minutes of our panel event to audience Q&A. So we do have a list of questions already posted in the chat. The first question was related to the Russian invasion of Georgia, what brought an end to that. Am I safe to say that that was answered in full and completely enough, or should we discuss further? Is there any other commentary or insight that you would like to add related to the Russian invasion of Georgia and the way that it was responded to by international actors? All right,
maybe just members of the panel would say a few words about it, but from my side, it was all I wanted to express here.
Thank you. Okay. Then let's move on to the second question, which relates to international responses to Russia's aggression against Ukraine. Within the panel, we have primarily focused on Western, NATO, and EU-based responses in support of Ukraine and condemning Russia. But the second question brings us to possible sources of Russian support for its intervention. Is Russia completely isolated? How would you evaluate China's support for Russia or silence apart from the global support for Ukraine? And as a follow-up question, would China be a game changer? And this is from Dr. In-Kyung Kim at Bridgewater State University. Thank you for this insightful question. And Dr. Cross, would you mind leading us on this question?
Sure, I'd be happy to, and apologies again for jumping out and jumping back in, but I do think this question about China is really one of the most important things we're looking at right now in terms of how the war will play out. Because as you know, Putin has asked Xi Jinping for assistance, military assistance, supplies, economic assistance. And 20 days before the invasion, when Xi and Putin met, they declared that their friendship had no limits. Of course, I think at that point, when the invasion occurred, Xi Jinping thought that the invasion would be relatively quick, at least that Kyiv would be toppled relatively quickly. But now that things are drawing on longer, it's complicating things. And it's for a number of reasons, actually. China has close ties, actually, with both Ukraine and Russia. So in 1992, China was among the first to establish close ties with Ukraine when it became independent. So it trades, it's invested tons of money in Ukraine on roads and other infrastructure. It also gets arms from Russia. So China doesn't necessarily want to be in a position of choosing between the two, but now it's not only choosing between the two, but also facing a potential proxy war with the rest of the world, the West and US particularly, in the Ukraine situation. So, you know, if China starts to arm Russia, for example, you basically have on both sides other countries arming each other. Russia would no longer be alone, which means it could potentially draw out the war much longer and maybe make more advancements. But at the same time, the US has promised, and there was very recently a very intensive meeting on this, that if China starts to undermine the sanctions against Russia, China itself would be sanctioned. And this is a pretty significant statement because China is far more globalized, actually, than Russia. And it has the largest foreign reserves in the world. So we've already seen that the world is, and especially the West, is willing to freeze Russia's foreign reserves, has already done so. So if China faces that, and that would be like more at the extreme level, that's a huge blow to China's prosperity and economy. So hopefully, of course, China will not help Russia, because this would then mean that you have two powers there standing together, and especially China as a much bigger, more powerful country than Russia, standing with Russia and the rest of the world sort of against Russia. So the World War III scenario becomes a little more crystallized there. But if China does start to actually make moves in these directions, even in seemingly more innocuous ways, like providing resources that aren't military, but do undermine the sanctions in place against Russia, I think the US and others will respond with sanctions against China.
Thank you so much for that comprehensive response. Paulina, if you would like to add any additional insight, you are more than welcome.
And just to add several points to it, China is a very pragmatic actor. At the same time, it is the biggest importer of Russian gas. So China has upper hand. China cannot be coerced into supporting Russia in this conflict at all. Also, China, at the same time, China and Russia, they have overlapping interests in Central Asia, because China invested billions of dollars into infrastructure and economies of states that Russia considers historically its area of influence in Central Asia. And Russia serves as a security guarantor and protector of those assets, because as Russia recently proved with its collective security treaty organization deployment in Kazakhstan, that it is willing to use force in order to assure stability in the region. So those two are very intertwined, China and Russia, but I would not expect China to be forced to entering the war on Russian side. If China makes any moves, it's for economic gains rather than any other considerations. And one of the reasons why China and Russia, they cooperate so closely and so well is that there is no ideological, not differences, but there is no ideological dialogue at all. They are not talking to each other about the type of domestic regimes they're supposed to have or any kind of values they're promoting in the world. It's a very pragmatic cooperation, and that's important. And ironically, because it's a very pragmatic cooperation, it will be more pragmatic of China not to support Russia in this war.
And
I could
Dr.
just
Haas,
add,
go ahead.
sorry. I just wanted to clarify, I wasn't saying China would be forced into supporting Russia at all. Like that would be completely off the table because China is far bigger in every respect. No, but what I was saying was more that if China decided in light of that partnership it had sort of struck with Russia, that it believed in sort of autocracies standing together as an alternative to democracy. So it would be a kind of ideological decision, also economic, but not purely economic, because, you know, this is about sort of the idea of autocracies providing an alternative to democracies. So I think so far China has actually been distancing itself from Russia, but with this call from Russians to put China on the spot like this, you know, we're all kind of waiting with bated breath. What is it going to decide? Considering it said its friendship had no limits. Hopefully, it will not sort of take it to the limits like that. But we'll have to see. But certainly, it will not be forced in any way into anything involving Russia.
And I would agree with those perspectives and mainly add that one of the main reasons that I believe China and Russia are cooperating is due to the fact that they both have revisionist aspirations. They both see the Western liberal world order as a hindrance to their global status, as a hindrance to their rightful place in the world as global powers in their own right. The main difference, however, is that China benefits immensely from the Western economic world order, and they would like to see that remain in place for as long as their economy and their power benefits from these international economic structures. And China does surely have a pragmatic foreign policy in relation to Russia's aggression. We saw China's response at the United Nations, and time and time again, they tend to abstain instead of voting for or against a specific action directly. And this does speak to an attempt to remain some sense of neutrality as to not incur economic consequences by the rest of the world. Dr. Elashvili, if you go ahead.
I just want to make a brief comment that we should try to avoid any further Olympic Games happening in China. There is a very bad correlation. In 2008, it was during the Olympics in Beijing, then Russia invaded to Georgia, and this time it was right after the Olympics. I don't know, maybe he's meeting with a Chinese prime minister or whoever he is, and this guy encourages him to invasions. I don't know, but there is a correlation. So let's try to avoid Olympics happening in China, because after that, Russia misbehaves always. I don't know why.
One needs to research that causality, possibly. Now, any other comments to make on China's possible, maybe improbable support for Russia? And yes, 2014 in the chat. So the other question that we have, and I'm taking these in the order in which they were submitted on the chat. We have one by Donna Olson, and it is in relation to Russia's possible history of aggression. So would you guys argue that there is some historical foundation for Russia being an aggressor state within Eastern Europe? And if so, why? What makes us think this way? What underlies that assumption? If you want to go ahead, Polina.
You saw me making faces, right? So it's one of my favorite topics when I teach Russian foreign policy to the Fletcher students. When we say great power, we usually mean a state with a high GDP, with extensive military capabilities, with some intellectual potential, all of this together, also capable of deploying its power far beyond its borders, right? That's what we think about as a great power. In Russian mentality, and again, historically, it doesn't matter, we talk Russian Empire, we talk about the Soviet Union or the Russian Federation of today. It doesn't work this way. Russia is what in Russian called a держава, and держава is a concept, it's literally a great power in Russian, but not only that. There is also a religious component to this word, which means that it's God-chosen state. So by Russian belief, it is a great power, not because it has a high GDP, which it does not, extensive military capabilities, that's debatable, and can deploy its power far abroad. Russia has exactly one aircraft carrier and it's not functional. So it's because of the nature, by nature, Russia is created a great power. So why Russia is so aggressive? Because it's often frustrated that other states does not treat it as such. It's a metaphor would be, if you were born a queen, but no one treats you as a queen, you constantly get frustrated and you get aggressive and you attack people, demanding them to treat you like a queen. So that's the constant explanation for Russian aggression, because it believes that it does not receive the treatment it deserves, but not based on capabilities or GDP or ability to project power, but by the nature of being this держава, a God-chosen nation, which is a great power by definition. It's again very broad picture, but it's always in the backdrop of anything Russia is doing as an empire, Soviet Union, or a federation today.
Dr. Cross or Dr. Elashvili, would you like to expand or respond?
Sure. I mean, I think Polina's explanation is very valuable, and we do need to look to the historical text that Putin himself references and kind of the culture, and then this sense of inferiority or lack of recognition. Russia has not really been a great power. It's been a regional power. But I would also put a lot of emphasis on Putin himself as an individual. I think that, you know, in my own work in political science, I think individuals have agency, and it does matter that Yeltsin chose Putin as his successor and not somebody else. Of course, Putin is a product as well of everything Polina explained and laid out nicely. But at this moment, remember, as I said earlier in our discussion today, Putin was actually moving towards closer ties to the West, and then he reversed that. And now he really is acting in a maximalist, aggressive way. And to the point where many experts who've looked at Putin over the years think that he may actually have some mental illness from being, you know, closed away for 2 years during the pandemic. So I think individuals do matter, and that he is making these choices. And ultimately that may be the crux that sort of determines what happens, because if the Russian people and the Russian military start to see him as the individual to blame for failures on the battlefield, for example, they may ultimately remove him. It doesn't mean it removes the problem for the reasons Polina outlined, but the individual matters in terms of the timing and the reversal of the policies that we've seen.
So much. We have the international and the state and the individual level brought forth in the panel. Always something I'd love to see. Dr. Elashvili, would you like to add any further commentary on the question?
Yes, please. I'll just add very briefly that it has to do something with the national identity, I guess, of Russians, because it's somehow related with the expanding of the borders and conquering new territories. And probably that was formed throughout the history, because due to the, I mean, in the eastern direction, there were a lot of land to be explored and to be conquered and connected to the Russian Empire. But then it ended up with, if you look through the Russian history, it's a history of war and expanding the borders and advancing into different directions. Yeah, that was quite common for the generally for the Europe in those centuries. But Russia somehow is still there. I mean, this is how they still position. This is how they still put their identity, and that's a problem. That's how I see that.
So identity-based politics driving some of our contemporary foreign policy here. Polina, I see that you would like to follow up.
Yeah, I just would like to add emphasis to what Maya just said, because it's very important. Often this isolation of Putin is dismissed as almost like a conspiracy theory, but I absolutely agree that individual level here is crucial, and I would like to offer a causal mechanism how that happened specifically. So Putin stayed in isolation for 2 years. He was really very afraid of COVID, and then he decided to talk only to about the most important issues with the most important people. And because of his personal background and thinking, those are mostly security officials. Security officials in Russia, they benefit from Putin thinking that Russia is under threat because it affects the allocation of resources that they then squander through different corruption mechanisms, because corruption in Russian defense and security is huge. So they kept painting for 2 years this picture of Russia under attack because they personally benefited on very material level from allocation of resources into security. And now suddenly, when Putin actually decided to act, his head is full of this security-focused nonsense about NATO attacking Russia or things like this. And that's how coronavirus, isolation, KGB background, individual preferences, and corruption together came into this decision to invade Ukraine.
Oops. Thank you so much. And I appreciate the causal link here. And I will very quickly veer into our more recent question in the chat, just because it relates directly to some of what Polina was talking about. From our perspectives, do we see Putin's behavior currently as typical, or are we noticing a certain amount of atypical, or I quote, unhinged behavior that would not be usual for him? And so the reason I jumped to this question is because it does directly relate to our current discussion on the isolation. Anyone want to chime in?
I could say a little bit. I'm not a Russia expert, but I will say that, you know, I think that it's telling that there's actually no way that Putin can really win at the end of the day. And so when you look at someone who many people have thought was capable of strategic and logical reasoning, then put himself into a position where he's miscalculated on multiple levels, and in a way he's already lost, right, as an isolated country. I think you do have to wonder whether you know, that he is still able to calculate in the same way that he used to be able to calculate.
And I would add to that and say that Putin has developed a reputation for being some sort of master strategist, for being rational and pragmatic and calculating, and even people who dislike him and think he is, you know, very bad in many ways will give him credence for these, you know, supposed qualities. But when it comes to his direct and full invasion of Ukraine, I don't necessarily see any prudent strategy at play here. He could have stopped at Crimea. Again, not ideal. He could have stopped within the eastern region and recognized those as independent. But the fact that he directly invaded Ukraine, continues to do so in full force, in my personal and also research-based opinion, it's not, as the realists would say, prudent policymaking based on cost and benefit analysis, if anything at all. Dr. Belyakova?
Yeah, so I would actually push back at this, even though on the general scheme of it all, I agree with you, but specifically take into account the isolation of 2 years. In the picture that is currently painted in Putin's head, he continues to be a rational actor, still opportunistic as he was before he saw the opportunity, and driven by security concerns. The problem is that the picture in his head is not adequate. But within that world of his own, he is still a very rational actor. There is one non-typical thing about his behavior is that Russia is traditionally called a kleptocracy, meaning that personal gain for the officials is more important than anything in the country. So basically, an opportunity to steal is more important than an opportunity to take over, say, Crimea, for example, or start a war in Ukraine. And this is not typical. We see actually the prevalence of security considerations over kleptocracy. And it, in my opinion, points to the fact that those security considerations are very serious in Putin's head. So he's not using NATO as a pretext to invade Ukraine for some other reason. I do think that he does believe that NATO was about to attack the Kremlin, or like to do something devastatingly dramatic against Russia. Again, it's not factually correct, so it seems irrational to us, but it might seem rational to him in his world.
Thank you for that. And of course, the thought of NATO directly invading a nuclear power, the world's largest nuclear power, is something extremely irrational in terms of political science. So now we are about 2 minutes from the closure of our panel. So unfortunately, I will not be able to get to all the questions in the chat. But I do want to hand over the remaining minute to Dr. To so he can offer us some concluding remarks. Thank you so much to our panelists. It has been a very productive discussion, and I hope we get a chance to continue it in another platform. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Professor Kushi. I think even though we talked about the crisis for about 90 minutes, there are still questions remaining that we cannot do justice to it today. And obviously the crisis is still going on. I'm concerned about of course, the point that has been raised over again about the extent to which the Russian invasion would impact the people around Russia and the oppression of people who wanted to be aligned more to the West. And this point has been raised very thoroughly in the discussion. And I'm also concerned about the militarization of Europe. And as you know that for experts here who have studied security and military intervention, we know that the militarization of Europe, whether by NATO or the United States, continue to be watched by the world, and whether it's Russian rhetoric or thinking about the international politics. Finally, I'm also concerned about the refugee crisis and the humanitarian toll that the crisis has inflicted on people all around the world. That it raised a lot of questions about the future of refugees. So to follow up with this, we are going to have the next panel on April 20th, and to talk about the refugee crisis in Ukraine, Afghanistan, and other parts of the world, and including comparison with Syria and other refugees. And I wanted to thank everyone here, especially the speakers, as Professor Cross from Northeastern University, who was just had to go away to have a national TV interview, I think on NBC. So, she was trying to juggle her time here. Dr. Belekova from Tufts University, Fletcher School of Diplomacy, and of course also Professor Elashvili, Fulbright Scholar, and also from Iliad State University in Georgia, and of course last but not least, and very importantly, Professor Kushi for her insights and efforts to moderate this panel so well to all of us. So thank you for all the people in the audience. So all we can do as Americans is to continue to advocate for, peaceful resolution to the conflict, and hopefully an end of the invasion, and an outcome that would really benefit not just the Ukrainian people, but those Russian people who are opposed to the war as well. So again, thank you very much, everyone. I hope you have a nice day.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Organizing, thank you.
Thank you, Sidita. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.